Hey, welcome to the first episode of the NC Sesame podcast. I'm your host, Joelle Castex. Each episode, we will speak with the people who are leading the charge to make our K-12 schools safer for every student. You'll hear from advocates, survivors, scholars, legislators, activists, parents, journalists, anyone and everyone who is passionate about ending educator sexual misconduct. And I'm more than just a host for this podcast. I'm also a survivor. I have dedicated my career to advocating for students and other survivors to make sure that what happened to me as a vulnerable high school student doesn't happen to another child. So let's get started. Please welcome my first guest, NC Sesame board member Faith Colson. Faith is the inspiration behind Faith's Law, landmark legislation in Illinois that protects students from educator sexual misconduct. After coming forward with her account of sexual abuse by an educator, Faith identified critical gaps in the law and took action. She partnered with legislators, survivors, and education stakeholders to draft, revise, and ultimately pass two major pieces of legislation. Today, she speaks nationwide on the issue of educator sexual misconduct and continues to support survivors and policy advocates working for change across the country. Faith, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Joelle. I'm happy to be part of the podcast.
Oh, this is great. So I'd love to hear more about you. You do amazing work, and you do it for a very important reason. So are you comfortable sharing your story? You can share as much or as little as you want. And what brought you here to NC Sesame and your advocacy work?
So I like to refer to myself as an accidental advocate because I kind of fell into it after just writing one email to a legislator. But I'll take you back before that as the why behind the story. So back when I was 17 years old and a junior in high school, I was in AP Physics, and halfway through the school year, my teacher started showing me special attention and kind of saying how I was the number one kid in class, and asked me if I wanted to go to college to study physics and what kind of career I might have in physics. And so he asked me to meet him after school one day to talk about college and careers. And so that was the first time that I met with him privately, and where it kind of started what I described as a mentor relationship at the time. That's how I viewed it. And so shortly after that, he invited me to go to church with him. And sometimes I would attend church with him. I would drive myself and meet him there. And he basically became what I thought was another safe adult that I could confide in. And just like all kids need adults, whether it's their parents or people beyond their parents, all kids lean on adults for guidance and for support. And so that's how I thought our relationship was. And then about maybe 4 months after that first meeting, one day after school, he kissed me. And I remember feeling confused, but I didn't know what to do with that. And so I didn't tell another adult. And within a couple of weeks of that, he had sexually assaulted me inside the school building. So once that happened, it was clear to me that if anyone found out, that he would be in really big trouble. And he said that to me. So I didn't realize at the time, but that made me really feel responsible for keeping the secret. And so unfortunately, the emotional attachment he had built over the couple of months leading up to that made me not want to tell anyone. And I was basically in that situation with him for 4 years. And I left of my own volition at age 21 when I was a junior in college. And I remember thinking, one day I'll have a normal life. I'll get married, I'll have kids, and just being on the phone and realizing I'm crazy. Like, this is never going to happen, and that I needed to leave. And so I cut off all communication with him. I ended up changing my contact information and just made a clean break and just tried to move on. I finished up my last year of college, which was great because I wasn't carrying this burden around. I moved back home with my parents, not realizing how much this had impacted me. And I just tried to move on with life. And I like to visualize it. Like I put that experience in a box and I put it on a shelf, and I tried to forget the shelf was there. I remembered that it happened, but it was in my rear view, and I wanted it to stay in my rear view, and I was just trying to move forward. So along the way, I got married, had kids, and one day I reached out to one of my kids' teachers because they were finally all in school. I was a stay-at-home mom. I had more time because they were all in school, and so I was going to volunteer as a math tutor. And the teacher that I reached out to said, "That's fine, but you'll have to go through a background check." And something about that just hit a nerve. Not that I was mad that they asked that, but something about it just bothered me. And so I told my friend, hey, something about this is really upsetting me. I never forgot what happened, but it's just weighing on me heavily. And she said, "I don't think you ever processed that you were abused." And so my analytical brain kicked in, and I said, well, I guess if I was abused, I need to go to therapy. So I'll find a therapist, and I'll check that box. And it wasn't until several months into therapy that I started thinking through what if this person could do it again. And so that led me to make a delayed outcry. The delayed outcry thankfully did result in the ability to press charges. That process took about a year. And it was in that criminal justice process that, and right in the aftermath of it, that I realized how many warning signs were missed that I didn't know about when I was a student. And that's what prompted me into advocacy, which I wouldn't call it advocacy then. I just thought, well, I'll email a state legislator, and just say, can you help fix this loophole? And so I sent one email. I had never done anything like that before. I was not politically active really besides to vote, but I looked up a legislator. I emailed and said, I'm Faith, didn't use my last name. This happened to me. I found these loopholes. Can you fix them? And I really thought that would be the end of it. And now, 6 or 7 years later, I have a law named after me, and I've been able to connect to so many people, and it's because she responded. She listened, she replied, and for 2 to 2.5 years, we worked very closely together with many other stakeholders and other legislators to write this law, and in the end, they offered to name it after me. But it all started with going through the criminal justice process, going through therapy, and then just sending that simple email, and thankfully, she listened.
I have so many follow-up questions for that. That's first, thank you for sharing that, because I think that for a lot of older survivors, especially late high school, it's so easy to blame yourself and to say, well, I should have known better, or I was almost 18, or things like that. And you really, I think, hit the nail on the head with that power differential. He found your vulnerable spot. Oh, you want to go to college, you're a smart kid. And that's how he got in there. In the criminal justice process, what was the final outcome for him?
So the crime in Illinois, the reason I was able to press charges was because the contact started when I was 17. So there were 2 different crimes that were committed. He pled to a lesser crime to avoid jail, but still has to register as a sex offender. So he is a convicted sex offender, can never work with children again, which was really all I was after. So because what I was concerned about, he wasn't teaching anymore, but I was concerned that what if he hurt someone in a church setting? Because kind of like you said about vulnerabilities, all kids are vulnerable because they're children. There's a power differential for all kids. But one of the other vulnerabilities that he picked up on for me, I wouldn't call it a vulnerability, but just was religion. And even though I was attending a public high school, religion was very deeply woven into the grooming process, which made the recovery a lot more complicated for me. But the result was, because he's a convicted sex offender, he can't volunteer. Like, if he was going to volunteer somewhere where they did background checks, that would also be flagged. And that's really all I was after. Was I wanted there to be a warning to anywhere he would work with youth that he was not safe around youth. Because as an adult, looking back and looking at how vulnerable my children are, I see how easy this would be, not just in a school setting, but in a church setting, because people just don't know what to look for, and they don't know how to prevent it if they're not paying attention.
Coming forward to law enforcement is such a brave move, and I'm so proud of you for doing that. A lot of survivors are scared to call the cops. Mm-hmm. Because they think, oh gosh, they're not going to believe me. They're going to ask me all these intrusive questions. So can you tell me a little bit about that process and how you came through it and how it was a part of your entire healing journey?
Sure. So I also was scared about this. Once I went to therapy, I started to unpack how afraid I was of him and if he could find me. And even though I now live in another state, geographically, it's not like we live around each other, but I was nervous, what if he came after me? So I did have that fear. And one of the people I talked to was a family friend who was a retired police officer, and a couple of friends at church. And they just encouraged me, you're going to be okay. He's not going to come after you. This is, if you want to do this, you should do it, basically. They didn't pressure me. Like, no one put pressure on me, like, if you don't do it, you're doing something wrong. But they encouraged me, like, you will be able to get through this. And so that summer, I had 3 young children and a husband who traveled. So, I mean, I'm full-time mom while this is going on. And I'm going to therapy, and I would read abuse books. I was renting all these books from the library, and I'd read them in the Walmart parking lot just to not have the baggage at my house. Like, I'd park for an hour and read. And because I didn't want to bring it home to my kids, because I'm still full-time mom. My husband's gone a lot. He was very supportive, but he just traveled for his work. So they were all at basketball camp this one week in June. And the last day of basketball camp, I told myself, if I'm going to do it, I got to do it now, because otherwise my kids are going to be home and I won't have another opportunity where I'm alone in the house. And I called from Texas, the Schaumburg Police Department where I grew up. And I said, I need to make a report. Like, I need to report a crime. And they're like, okay, well, you're going to have to come into the station. And I told the dispatcher, I've been waiting 17 years to do this, and I need someone to take this report right now. And they did. They put someone on, and they listened. I mean, the report itself was just me talking. They didn't really ask a lot of questions, except at the end, they kind of said, someone will be calling you. This is what they're going to ask you. And then I was on pins and needles for who was going to call me and when they were going to call me. And ironically, like about a week, it was a couple of days. It was not that same day. I was at my friend's house with my daughters, and I had told her, like, hey, just so you know, I might get a phone call. I was just on 24/7, not sure. And they did call while I was there. And I mean, I ended up taking the call in her bedroom for like 30 minutes while I'm supposed to be spending time with my friend to answer those questions. So that first hurdle of just calling, a lot of people have to go in physically. I called because I wasn't in the geographic area, but that was a big hurdle to get over, just the shock of it. The intrusiveness of questions, like, yes, that happens. I did have a female detective, which I think helped a lot. And she was I can't say anything negative about her. She was fantastic, but it is uncomfortable talking about this. And so it is helpful if you have, someone in your life that you can vent to. When I did later have to go up, when they had enough evidence that I was given the opportunity to press charges, I did have a support person come with me for that to the station, because I did have to go in physically to talk to the assistant attorney or something like that. And my support person couldn't come in the room while they interviewed me, but I did have someone come with me. My sister came with me for that, because emotionally that was very overwhelming. And the other thing that was just surreal was, I think it was later that night, it might have been the next morning, I'm staying with my parents. I don't live there anymore, so I had to fly up for this. He was on the local Chicago news, and that was surreal. And I remember laying in bed, thinking I felt I'm responsible that someone's going to get arrested. And it was a very surreal feeling. And I think I've heard other survivors talk about this. Like, we need to remind ourselves, we did not do this to them.
You did nothing wrong.
They did something
wrong.
to us.
Yeah.
Right. Like, they are being held accountable for the choices they made. And you brought up that, I should have known better. That is the lie that I believed for 17 years. And it took going to therapy and looking at this from an adult, looking at a child, instead of viewing myself as a child who was mature enough to know better, looking back and saying, I did not know better, and he did. And so the criminal, I'm so grateful I was able to press charges. And I would just say to people who are thinking about that, it is very emotional. I remember when I was given the opportunity, do I want to press charges or not? I really struggled with that. But at the end of the day, for me, I thought, I want to know that I did what I could to stop this person. And I didn't want to know that I could have pressed charges and chose not to. So it is emotional, but I'm very grateful I did that step, and I'm grateful that I saw results. I will just say as a caveat that delayed outcries are very hard to prove. And I was fortunate that the detective said from the start, I believe you, but this is, we have to corroborate not just that it happened, but when it happened, and this is going to be difficult. So it is something to be sober-minded about for survivors going in. Like, I was able to press charges, but a lot of people cannot. And I know someone personally who came forward, similar steps as far as the reporting. The result was not the same. But I would encourage people to take that step if they have the support in their life to do it. I think it's every survivor's choice, but I'm very glad that I took that step, and it was emotional, but looking back, I'm so glad that I did that.
Well, and police officers are so much better trained now in trauma-informed forensic interviewing, and it wasn't like it was even, 20 years ago where it was, are you sure it happened? Did you misconstrue? Everything
Right.
else. So that is amazing. So, I want to go back to something you just said, and I've been working with survivors of child sexual abuse for like 20 years now. And one of the things that I find interesting is the evolution of language. And you called it a delayed outcry. I think that's interesting because I had just heard outcry used for the first time at a training that I was at just a couple months ago, because it used to be my story, and then it was my account, and then it was a disclosure. Does outcry have a special meaning to you, or tell me about the use of that word?
I mean, I think this answer is a short that no, I don't know that I've put as much thought into it as you have with the professional experiences you have, seeing that change over time. I think because I didn't work in a trauma-related field. I didn't have professional experience with abuse victims or survivors before I made that report. I don't know how I stumbled upon that word, honestly. I mean, delayed disclosure is also something that I'm familiar with, and I know that there's a couple of other terms out there, but I don't want to misuse them. So I'm not sure what made me first use that term, but I guess the delay is the part that is useful in the context of how I used it, as far as people who want to come forward, but they're an older I was 34 when I came forward, so the crime was 17 years old. I was not limited by the statute of limitations, but there's no physical evidence at that point. I mean, there's some things that just make this hard to prove regardless, but especially when there's that time gap. So I don't think I have a great answer for that one.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I'm sure we could do a whole other podcast episode on this, but what they talked about in the training was that, kids don't come forward and say, so-and-so sexually abused me. They usually come forward and go, I hate that person, or why did you make me do that? Or there's drugs or alcohol or self-harming behaviors. And that's an outcry. It may not be a disclosure, but it's an outcry. So we'll have a whole other episode on that.
Yes, that's a very good point. So maybe I'm misusing the word. I'm not sure.
No, I think it's great because, and it shows. So how old are you now? Do you mind my asking?
I'm 41.
Okay, so I'll be 55 next week, and I came forward when I was 32. And you can see just how in that, 14 years, how things have changed, because I had no criminal statute of limitations. I had, at the time we ended up changing the law and I was able to come forward civilly. And it was, the abuse happened in the 80s. So everyone's like, oh, you should have known better, all those other things. So it's shown how legislatively, lawmakers have made big strides. So let's get into that. So what were the loopholes that you wanted to fix in Faith's law?
So the two primary loopholes that I went in trying to fix were that the age cap in Illinois is 17. So if I would have been 18 when the sexual contact occurred, there would have been no crime committed. So that was the first loophole I was concerned about. And that doesn't just affect kids who are still in high school when that crime happens. It also affects kids who it happened to in the past, because the whole problem with my case, the challenge to my case, was they didn't just have to prove that there was sex or that there was sex while I was a student. They had to prove that there was sex while I was an underage student. And that's a lot harder to timestamp, which in the end they were able to corroborate. But that is, it doesn't just impact while it's happening, it impacts the ability to get justice after the fact. So that was one of the loopholes I wanted to fix. And then the other primary loophole going in that I wanted to address was this idea of how to intervene sooner so that these warning signs that were overlooked could result in action, as opposed to someone waiting to see sexual abuse happening. Because I think there's a misconception where people think this doesn't happen, it doesn't happen here, it's not going to happen in my community, it's not going to happen in my school, or if it did, I would see it. And so if people are walking, if educators are walking around with an understanding of sexual abuse being committed by committed pedophiles, and that they must have a creep vibe, they have this idea that I would spot that. I would be able to tell if this was happening. But what they don't realize is people who commit sexual abuse of children, they are smart enough not to actually commit the sexual contact abuse in front of other mandated reporters. But generally speaking, they are going to commit these somewhat brazen boundary violations where they're super touchy, or they speak sexually about students, or these other visible signs that maybe by themselves are not criminal, but are indicators of poor boundaries with kids. And so in my case, what that looked like, and I didn't find this out until after I went through the criminal justice process, my abuser would constantly make sexual remarks about his female students to the other teachers. And that was for years. That was not just one or two comments. That was for years. So basically there was this idea like he's a pervert, but he wouldn't actually do anything. But we didn't know, me and my fellow 17-year-old girls who look like women but have the minds of children still, we don't know that our teacher is seeing us as a piece of meat and talking about our bodies behind our back to mandated reporters. And that went on for years. So that was one of the warning signs missed. Another thing people remembered, and they remembered it 17 years after the fact, was rumors about the teacher. And one of the people even remembered that he said he wished he could hook up with a student. 3 different people at my school knew he said he was in a relationship with me, but no one ever reported that. No one said anything. It never left the school. And that was when I was still underage that he said that. That was what could be timestamped. So, did someone see him sexually abusing me visually? Did they come in and walk into a room while he was sexually abusing me? No. But were there other things that were unprofessional enough that he should have been out of the classroom before I ever had him? Yes. And so my initial goals were make the crime better, but also have better administrative rules so that these people can be removed from the classroom and we're not waiting for them to commit a crime. Teachers, the threshold of morality for teachers is not, are you committing sex crimes against children? It's, can you be trusted unsupervised with naive teenagers who will trust you and think that you care about them and are told to obey you? That's a very high level of trust. And people need to be very firm in upholding their boundaries if they're being given that level of trust. And so those were kind of the primary loopholes that we went after. It was kind of a 2-pronged administrative and criminal set of goals.
And so what was the eventual outcome of
that? The bad news is the criminal update on upping that age to protect all students still has not passed in Illinois. It was cut out of Fate's law at the risk of blocking the entire law. We had to remove that, which was unfortunate, but necessary to get everything else through. Several people have tried to refile that legislation, and it's gotten through the House, but it won't move in the Senate. So that's the bummer, is that the age cap for the criminal behavior is still there. However, we've made a ton of improvements on the administrative side of things. So we've defined sexual misconduct. We've stipulated some additional things that are in the code of conduct so that schools put in writing what their rules are. For example, if it's allowed to if you're allowed to transport a student in your car, how to define interactions with students outside your professional role to make sure that people are not embedding themselves in children's lives to groom them without any sort of boundaries there. And so we've gotten better behavior standards set up so that there is something to hold people accountable to, which has raised the level of awareness for school people to pay attention to this. And then we also passed a screening law, which passed in several other states first, and it's generally known as the Sesame Act because of Sesame's involvement in that in the first state it passed. But the screening law basically says that when anyone applies to a school, whether it's private or public school, whether they work for the school or as a contractor that is placed in the school, when someone is applying for a new position, the hiring entity has to ask their former employers if there's any history of sexual misconduct in the employment history. So instead of just doing the background check, when most people are not going to have criminal histories for this, we're also doing an employment history check to make sure that we're seeing any flags and that people are not hiding that. So those are the biggest things. There were some other changes too within that, but those are that kind of the bigger changes that have been making the impact and kind of setting the standard.
That last part of the law, I think, is really relevant because we have that in California. So even if you're applying to be a substitute teacher, for example, I've had some spare time, I'll apply to be a substitute teacher. I was a credentialed teacher in Colorado 30 years ago. Had to put all that down, and they're going to go back and check and make sure there's nothing on my record there. And that stops the phenomenon of that you and I know of as passing the trash, right, where districts just push their bad people out and then they just get a job at another district because they haven't had, any kind of criminal action, or it's been that rumor stuff going on that no one has reported. So tell me, how did you stumble onto Sesame?
So the first phone call I made to Sesame, they probably were like, who is this woman? Because I was frantic, trying to make sure I knew what laws to pass. And so by that time I was already connected to the legislator. I already knew of some of the loopholes that were problematic in my case. And I knew Illinois law and some of the problems in it, but I was calling Sesame because I wanted to make sure that if I have the ear of a legislator, I want to make sure I'm giving her the right solutions. And so I kind of had rapid fire questions, and I'm sure I'm a lot sometimes. I'm a lot, and I am a very detailed person. I ask a lot of questions. And anyway, I'm sure it was a frustrating phone call that they took.
I think you're perfect, so you're fine.
But I'm just saying, I'm sure that my introduction to Sesame was a lot because I had very specific questions on like, what do I need to fix? I want to make sure if she's listening to me that I fix all the problems. I don't want to miss something and have it be my fault that the law isn't as good as it should be. But I think I was just Googling something one day and just stumbled upon the website and was surprised to see, like, holy cow, there's an organization that is just devoted to this problem. And that's, I've heard other survivors talk about this, and this is why when I first was coming to terms with the fact that I was abused and going to therapy, I was looking up books and reading lots of books about abuse and trauma just to try to make sense of what I was feeling. And you go through it and you think, wow, that this thing I've always had is related to this experience I went through, and I'm not crazy. Like, that there's an explanation for why I feel this way or why I relate that way. And so by the time I stumbled upon Sesame, I was already kind of through therapy, or kind of had done a lot of work in therapy personally, but I was like down to business. Like, I need answers for what needs to go in this law because someone is listening and I want to make sure it works.
So you did something, and you did it accidentally, and it's only something that I learned later on, and I think the reason that you were so successful in passing face law is that you closed loopholes. And legislators love to close loopholes because they're not writing a whole new law, they're not making any big changes, they're just making little tweaks. And I think that was a huge reason for your success and why you were able to get it passed, and why you've been able to. Now, have you been able to replicate this in other states? Face law?
So Right. I want to make clear, I know that there are other people who have laws named after them, and sometimes they, after passing it in one state, they're like, we want to see this in all 50 states, and they go about it systematically. When I finished the trailer bill to face law, there was the first law that passed and then a trailer bill. I was exhausted, and I thought, like, I'm moving on. And one of my friends asked me, like, so what state are we doing next? And I kind of said, like, I'm good. Like, I'm tired. This was a lot of work. I mean, it was like a part-time job for 2.5 years. I mean, it was a lot.
It's a full-time job. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I was not just the namesake of this. I was helping write. I was helping edit. I was attending all these meetings. I was very tied into it. And so I was emotionally exhausted. And really the way it went from passing that in one state to helping other states is that along the way, being connected to Sesame and another group that I met along the way, and then slowly branching out and learning kind of who else was operating in this space, both me making connections and then people calling in. A couple of people have called in over the years to my legislator because up until very recently, I had no online presence. I didn't have any social media, so there was no way to find me. But someone would stumble upon face law and call my legislator to ask to get in touch with me. That's happened a couple of times where then they want to replicate it somewhere else, or they want to ask questions kind of like the ones you're asking about, you know, how do I do what you did kind of thing, or how can we take what you did and apply it to this other state? And so I am not, there is not another state that has passed Fate's law, but I have supported advocates and survivors in other states to help them with elements of similar laws. So I'm very much a proponent of if you're living in another state and you're a survivor or a parent advocate in that state, you know your state better than I do. And so I want to be a sounding board and kind of a consultant and help you learn what I learned so you don't have to learn it the hard way. But it's your state and it's your baby. And I kind of support, I have a joke with one of my friends who's a survivor that I'm her guy in the chair. She's Spider-Man. She's out saving the world. And I'm her guy in the chair, like phone a friend. And so I do most of my work from behind the safety of my computer screen. And I don't need to be the front runner there. If people are doing the work in their state, I want to support that. So to get back to the question you asked about, replicating it in other states, we haven't replicated it, copied and pasted it in its totality. But what I like to tell people is in Illinois, I found what the loopholes were and I tried to fix those loopholes. There's some common ones, but your state may not have the same loopholes. So you have to find where the law is working or not working in your state, and then find the solutions that plug those holes, which may look different because the starting point is different. So someone reached out to me from Texas 2 or 3 years ago now and said, this is what happened to my family. Can you help? And so the loopholes here in Texas were smaller than the loopholes in Illinois to begin with. But I had to do a lot of research, even though I was living here, to find, we're not replicating Fate's law because we're not patching the same hole, if that makes sense. But
yeah, it does.
But yes, I have supported people in it in several states, and I tried to let them run with that because they're the ones living there and they're the ones doing the work, and I just try to be their support person, whether it's emotional support because it's hard work, or whether it's actual advocacy support, like, oh yeah, use this resource, this is how we did this is the pushback to expect, this is how to overcome it, here's arguments you can make, here's people who can testify, things like that.
Well, and that's what people want the most. They don't want a one-size-fits-all bill that may not fit them, and they come with their own set of issues and their passions and the history of what's gone on in that state. The political temperature may be totally different. There may be some scandal that they can, address immediately. So what is your number one piece of advice to someone who's like, I want to change the law in my state, but I have no idea where to start?
Number one thing is, like, you can do it even if you don't know where to start. And I've joked many times about Schoolhouse Rock and I'm just a bill. And that was the extent of government knowledge that I had when I started this. I had no interest in government in high school at all. Least favorite class I took in high school. But normal people, regular, everyday people can do this. And if you're coming at it from the perspective of you're a survivor or you have some sort of personal angle with survivors or abuse history, you're coming in as a subject matter expert. And so the kind of the pathway from I have this idea and I have this story and I want to prevent what happened to me from happening to someone else. The number one thing I would say is find a sympathetic lawmaker. And from there, the amount of interaction you have really depends on the lawmaker. I am finding more and more that the legislator I worked with in Illinois was a bit of a unicorn in the sense that she was very collaborative, not just with me, but with educator groups. She really listened and wanted people to come to the table so that we crafted a piece of legislation that would work and not just look good on paper. Other people I've worked with or from a distance supported survivors working in their states, a lot of legislators aren't quite as collaborative, so you may not have to do as much of the legwork. I did a lot of the legwork myself where I was doing the research, but just to get your feet wet, I would say find a supportive legislator. That's like the number one thing to getting it passed is find your champion. As far as knowing what to bring to them, how to phrase it, there's a lot of resources online. Sesame has a legislation webpage. I have a website now that my husband had been begging me for a year. He's like, let me build this website for you. So I now have a website that has some of those resources, but there's other organizations that also have, help you find kind of a starting point to understand your state's laws. There's a lot of stuff out there if you need to do the research, but you can do it. So if you don't know where to start, part of it is just like deciding that you're going to start. And then I would say also having building a network of supportive people, whether it's personal support or people who have done something like this before, who they can just bounce ideas off, you can bounce ideas off of. That's very helpful, because it is, sometimes you really have to take one on the chin. You have to have some thick skin, and you have to thread the needle of, I'm a survivor and I have a story to tell, but some people will listen to your story, but some people will only listen to the statistics, and you have to thread that needle of, I guess, put the big girl pants on, like, I'm gonna do this, but it is difficult. It's very empowering, but it is difficult, because you're gonna run into people who are there with you. You're gonna run into people who maybe they don't know the problem, but they'll listen and they can become champions. And then occasionally you're gonna run into people who they're not going to be very helpful, and you either got to go around them or help people power over it, because not everyone is going to listen, but most people, if you call and say, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse, this happened to me, I want you to help me fix this, most people have the decency to at least listen. It's just a matter of, are they going to champion this? Do they, like you said, what is the local temperature in their state? Has there been a recent local scandal that has shown the need for this? The more local the story and the more local the buy-in, the better. But I could talk about that for hours and hours, so I'll stop, because then you can ask whatever specific question you have, because I really like this topic.
Well, I think you could talk all day long. So as far as like the allies, I think, because when you talked about your legislator and how the legislator was able to bring in the collaborators, I think that's super important, because when we worked to pass legislation in California, we were reopening the statute of limitations, and it was not a collaborative process because it was seen as an adversarial process, really. So if you don't bring people in as collaborators, they're going to see themselves as your enemies. And I think that when you take on education particularly, there's a lot of power in a lot of state capitals held by the whatever education consortiums there are. And I think that collaboration is super important, because if educators, teachers unions, so and so, see themselves as an enemy, they're going to fight it, and they have the money to do it. And I think your legislator and the work that you did was right on the money, because if you bring in those collaborators and everyone feels like we are all a part of making schools safer for kids and elevating our profession so that this stuff doesn't continue to happen.
Yes. And I think, I've seen, coming into that, I was a newbie, and I've joked with several people. I kept a box of Pepto-Bismol tablets next to my computer, because I had never done anything like this before, and I'm on calls with 30 or 40 people who are, half of them are state level lobbyists. This is their career, their profession. And I'm thinking, like, who am I? I'm just this random survivor. And I don't have the credentials to say, like, oh, I've been advocating for 20 years and I know my way around the Capitol building, so it was very overwhelming. And at first it felt like having so many people really slowed the process down, because I thought, we're saving kids. Like, I don't care what anyone thinks. Like, we're fixing this. But what I learned from that process and was modeled by my legislative sponsor and from being part of that, is that in some states, like you said, the education consortium is powerful enough. If they're your enemy, you're not passing it. And so Illinois is one of those. I mean, like, the education groups are very powerful. Some states don't have that education consortium is not as well listened to and is not as powerful to block something even if they want to. So that varies state to state. However, what is true in all states is if you're passing education policy that is going to be implemented in schools, then educators, whether it's teachers, administrators, whoever inside the school system, those are going to be the people that are implementing this law. So number one, they may bring to light some just practical things that I wouldn't know because I'm not working in a school system myself. But they also may, the fact that they're invited into that process and they have a little bit more buy-in, even if they're not crazy about it, I think that makes it more possible that they will follow it and that they will implement it a little bit better. And so I've seen examples, not necessarily on educator sexual misconduct, but other education policy where it was passed really without that educator voice, and then it was a train wreck because it was well-intentioned, but they just didn't foresee some of the unintended consequences. And so that's another big thing, loopholes, unintended consequences. There's some of these catchwords, and there's a reason why they're used a lot, is because it really is necessary when you're writing a piece of legislation, but in education, that you're thinking, okay, this is what I'm trying to fix. And I know my intentions are good, but if I write it this way, will it accidentally create a problem, either by incentivizing something bad or allowing some other problem, or maybe it will enable innocent teachers to be caught up in this net. And so there's just a lot of complexity to consider. And where it's possible, I do think it's important to work with education stakeholders. And one of the things I learned along the way is that there are a lot of administrators out there who really do want to help fix this problem. So there's good and bad examples anywhere. Sometimes, I've heard so many people talk about unions opposing things, and we had to work through some opposition at first. And unfortunately, I have had some negative experiences with, it seemed, where unions are trying to protect their teachers and don't see okay, but now you're protecting them to the extent that this is going to endanger children. Both sides needs to listen. And usually I have seen that we can all listen and get along. I have had some examples of less than great interactions, but I think trying to collaborate is what should at least be done first.
Yeah, and I can pretty much guarantee you that no one on those phone calls with all the lobbyists said, who the heck is this lady? You totally know what you're talking about. You got your ducks in a row.
You're seeing me now. But thank you. I appreciate that. And I one of my friends teases me about how, remember me when you're famous kind of, and it's very, and someone else said oh yeah, we know Faith. And I'm just still kind of riding the wave. And that's why I say I'm an accidental advocate. I'm very grateful, and I'm learning as I go. And I know so much more now than I did 6 years ago, but I know more now than I did 6 months ago. You're just always learning. Every state, every legislator, every group, I'm always learning. But thank you. I appreciate it. I don't know if they said that 6 years ago, but I appreciate the compliment.
Well, I'm saying it now, so that's all that matters. So what are you working on right now?
So I feel like there's always lots of irons in the fire. Obviously, as a board member of Sesame, I'm grateful to get to collaborate with other national leaders who have been at this work a lot longer than I have. I am an independent consultant on a project through Prevent Child Abuse America. They have a CDC grant to study the effectiveness of state laws. So I serve as community engagement coordinator right now as a consultant with that group. So that's been really rewarding and just helped me to get to know that organization, but other people who are working not just as advocates, but as researchers and other areas of policy. So, and then I'm also just on my own time, just as a volunteer, supporting as opportunities come up, people in other states. So I have people who I'm working with in Ohio and Kentucky. There's someone who I'm trying to support in Kansas right now. And then I'm still Texas, the mom who reached out to me 2.5 years ago. We were able to get some changes through this past session in spring. Texas meets every other year. And so the kind of the leftover policy goals that we didn't get through, I'm still trying to get that ball rolling and moving with legislators for next session, which is going to be, 1.5 years from now. But those are some of the rumblings I'm trying to just stay tied into. And next to my computer, I have, a stack of files, and I just try to keep good notes so that I can keep things straight. But again, I try to say yes when people ask for help as much as I can within the limits of time that I have. I do work part-time from home on proofreading stuff just as a professional. So that's also a paid thing that's unrelated to advocacy. So really the biggest thing is time management. But again, I learned so much from doing this when I didn't have experience that I'm trying to support other people so that they're not having to learn the hard way. And so that's why, like I said, why I have the website now. It's got some resources up there. It has a contact so that if someone is where I was 6 years ago and said, I want to pass a law, this happened to me, or I've seen this happen in my kids' school, I think we can do better, what do? I try to just be a resource. But I also don't want to, name names with people I don't have permission to name their names, on the air.
So if someone's looking for you, how do they find you?
So probably the easiest way is just to go to faithslaw.org. And there's a contact me page on there. My email address is connected to that, info@faithlaw.org. But again, I'm also connected to Sesame as a board member, and the calls to Sesame are not going to get routed directly to me, but that's why I also have the personal website, because I want to be a resource to people if I can. But everyone, like you said, different states have different loopholes to start with. And so what I try to volunteer to people is that I may be an expert on model legislation. I'm an expert on how to interact when you have pushback and how to talk to legislators to get them to listen and all of that. But I am not an independent expert in all 50 states and what their loopholes are. Like, I generally do this as a volunteer, so I don't have, infinite time to do the research on the starting point in each state. But if people can help out finding that starting point, I can help point them in the direction of how to patch it.
Faith, this has been a fabulous interview. I'm so glad you're the first one for the podcast. I mean, it's just like, I can't wait to go through it, because there was so much fabulous information here. So we're going to close up. What have I missed? What do you want to tell survivors or parents or advocates? What closing thought do you want to leave with this podcast?
I think, and I don't plan on getting choked up, but this may make me choked up. But I think the number one thing that I would want to say, as coming from the voice of a survivor, is that when you're walking that road, whether you're still being victimized or you're still young, or you're like me, where you're looking back realizing, wow, this may have impacted me more than I thought, is that you don't have to be alone as you go through that process. And it's important to have other people to support you while you're recovering from that. So I didn't realize until I was an adult looking back that the biggest impact of the abuse on me was how I was utterly alone and trapped. And I didn't realize the extent of that while I was still a child and an early, teen into young adulthood. But that transition from childhood to womanhood was taken and was tainted and I won't get that back. And I didn't realize at the time how alone and trapped I was in that until I had a lot of years of separation from it. And so if someone is still in that space where they feel alone, I think the antidote and the salve on that wound is that you don't have to be alone, and there are people who can help you. So whether that's family and friends, I mean, some people are maybe better able to support people through that grieving process and recovery process than others. But I found a couple of my friends to be super empathetic. I was able to access mental health services through a therapist, and being able to walk that road and know that I'm not alone now. And same thing to parents of survivors. This is a hard thing to get through, but it can be got through. So if you're in the life of someone who has been through this, it's important to both empathize with what they have experienced and the depth of pain. This is a very painful human experience to go through. It changes your life, but you can get to the other side. And so if you're the support person for those people, just kind of remembering, like, I've got one hand on you down in the ditch, but I have one hand over here where there's hope, and you're not alone in it. And for me, what has helped me is, my family and friends, but also, despite my abuser using religion to harm me, kind of reclaiming that, God didn't do this to me. God is still good. And that, I can find hope on this side of it. So just reminding people, you don't have to be an advocate, a legislative advocate, and try to pass laws in order to recover and overcome and live your life. And some people, I like this work. I find it empowering. I've met people who think my overcoming is just living. Like, I don't want to just be thinking about this all the time. I just want to live. And that's overcoming as well. But there is hope for people who have been through this. And I would just say, don't do it alone. Find people that can help you through it, because that has been the thing I have learned most about myself, is that I don't need to be alone, and I need to be connected to other people to help me, and I can help them, and that hard things just can't be carried by yourself.
That's a perfect way to end this. I mean, I'm a little choked up too. So
yeah.
Again, Faith, thank you so much. I'm sure that you're going to get a lot of people reaching out to you after this goes live, and hopefully we'll have you back really soon. And thank you for all the work you're doing for NC Sesame and survivors and everyone. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this first episode of the NC Sesame podcast. And a special thank you to our guest, Faith Colson, for her leadership, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to protecting kids. If today's conversation resonated with you, please share this episode and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you use Apple Podcasts, a 5-star rating helps us be seen by even more people. Your support helps us reach more families, educators, and survivors who deserve information, healing, and change. To learn more, visit ncsesame.org and our social channels, our Facebook page, LinkedIn, and X. We're just getting these started, so be sure to like, follow, and join the conversation. Together, we can stop educator sexual misconduct and build schools where every child is safe. I'm your host, Joelle Castex. Thanks for listening.